I don't know why I chose to go camping. Maybe I thought being alone in the woods would help clear my mind. Maybe I wanted to be away from the noise of the world, away from people who kept looking at me with pity, telling me they were sorry for my loss. Maybe I just wanted to disappear for a while. It had been 7 months since Lisa died. 7 months of waking up and feeling like there was no reason to get out of bed. 7 months of sitting in our house, staring at her empty chair, her coffee mug still sitting where she left it. I had tried everything people suggested: therapy, exercise, even picking up old hobbies. Nothing worked. The grief sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving. So one morning, without really thinking about it, I packed a bag, grabbed my tent, and drove out to the woods. I chose a spot far from the main campground, deep in the forest where no one else would be. It was a small clearing by a narrow creek, surrounded by thick pines. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the occasional snap of a branch under some unseen animal's weight. It was exactly what I wanted: silence. The first night was uneventful. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and ate a can of soup. The stars were bright above me, the night air crisp. I sat there for hours, staring at the flames, feeling numb. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping. I opened my eyes, my heart suddenly racing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak orange light around my camp. The trees loomed tall and dark, their shadows shifting in the dim glow. I listened, holding my breath. Another snap, closer this time. A deer, I told myself. A raccoon. Maybe even just the wind knocking loose branches. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like something watching. I forced myself to breathe. I wasn't going to let my mind play tricks on me. I wasn't going to let grief turn into paranoia. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing, just endless forest. Still, I barely slept that night. The next morning, I told myself I had imagined it. I made coffee, ate some granola bars, and decided to go for a hike. Maybe moving would help clear my head. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. The air was cool, the scent of damp earth and pine filling my lungs. I walked for hours, not thinking, just moving. That was when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed into the soft dirt. Not boot prints, either, bare feet. I stopped, my stomach tightening. I wasn't near any main trails. As far as I knew, no one else was out here. I followed the prints for a while, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a hiker had wandered off trail. Maybe someone liked walking barefoot. But as I kept going, the prints started to look wrong. They weren't shaped right. The toes were too long, the arch too high, and they weren't spaced evenly like a normal person walking. Some were deep, others barely there, as if whoever made them had been moving strangely. I turned back. The hike back to camp felt longer. Every sound made my skin crawl. The rustling leaves, the distant crack of a branch. By the time I reached my tent, the sun was low in the sky. I built another fire, trying to shake the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. I sat there until dark, staring at the flames, listening. Then I heard it again. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I held my breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sounds weren't coming from one place. They were circling me. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, my hands shaking. Just an animal, I whispered to myself. That's all it is. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I aimed the flashlight at the trees. The beam swept over trunks, branches, empty space. Then, for a split second, it caught something. A shape. It was gone before I could get a clear look, but I saw enough. Pale skin, too tall, eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. My stomach twisted. I turned off the flashlight, my breath coming fast. I listened. The night was silent. Then I heard it. A breath, not mine. Slow, deliberate, just beyond the firelight. I grabbed my knife, my fingers wrapped so tightly around the handle they hurt. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Watching, waiting. I stayed awake all night, gripping the knife, barely breathing. When the sky started to lighten, I packed up my tent in record time. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie the straps on my backpack. As I hoisted it onto my shoulders, I glanced back toward the trees one last time. Something was there, just at the edge of the clearing, tall, motionless, watching. I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to run. I followed the path back to my car, my pulse pounding in my throat. I didn't look back, not once. When I reached my car, I threw my gear into the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something standing at the tree line. Too tall, too still. Then the road curved, and it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was back home. I locked every door, shut every curtain, but I couldn't shake the feeling, like something had followed me, like something was still watching. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. The grief had felt like drowning, like being trapped under a weight I couldn't lift. But in those woods, for the first time in months, I had felt something else. Fear. Real, tangible, immediate fear. And somehow it had cut through the numbness. I didn't know what I had seen out there. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was something real, something I wasn't meant to see. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. It was supposed to be a short break from work, a weekend trip out into the woods. My boss, a senior officer at the department, had been the one to suggest it. He wasn't the type you'd expect to enjoy the outdoors. Rigid, always in uniform, the kind of man who drank his coffee black and never let his guard down. But he swore by these solo camping trips, said they helped clear his mind. When he invited me along, I was surprised, but I didn't say no. We set out early on a Friday morning, the drive stretching long past the last gas station, past the paved roads and into gravel and dirt. The place he picked was deep in the woods, far from cell service, far from anything. I didn't mind, I wanted the quiet. The trees thickened as we drove, pine and oak stretching high, blotting out the sun in places. We didn't pass another car for miles. When we finally arrived, it was just a clearing near a small river, a flat spot for a tent, a fire pit from past campers, and the thick silence of the wild. We spent the first few hours setting up. The tent went up fast, the firewood was collected, and we ate a quick meal. By late afternoon, the air was already cooling, the sun dipping lower through the trees. Felt good to be out there. No noise except for the wind and the occasional rustling in the brush. As night fell, we sat by the fire, the orange glow casting long shadows across the trees. My boss was quiet, staring into the flames. I could tell something was on his mind, but I didn't ask. It wasn't until later, when we turned in for the night, that things started to feel off. I woke up sometime after midnight, unsure why. The fire had burned down to embers, a dim glow barely reaching beyond the tent. My boss was still asleep, steady breathing beside me. Then I heard it, soft but distinct. Footsteps, not an animal, not the rustling of a deer or the light scurry of a raccoon. These were slow, measured steps. Someone was outside. I stayed still, listening. The steps moved closer, stopping just outside the tent. I held my breath.
No flashlight, no voices.
Just silence and the feeling of being watched. Minutes passed. Then, just as suddenly as they came, the footsteps moved away. The sound of crunching leaves faded into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that. At first light, I stepped out, looking for signs of whoever had been there. Nothing.
No footprints. No disturbed brush.
But I knew what I had heard. My boss stirred, stepping out of the tent with a yawn. I didn't tell him what happened. Not yet. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just on edge. We spent the morning fishing at the river, cooking breakfast over the fire. For a while, it felt normal, until we found the first sign. About 100 yards from our campsite, just beyond where we had walked the night before, something was carved into a tree. Deep, deliberate slashes. Not from an animal. Not random. We stared at it for a long time. My boss didn't say anything, just ran a hand over the marks. Then, without a word, he turned back toward camp. I followed, my stomach uneasy. That night, we kept the fire high. I didn't mention the footsteps, but I could tell my boss felt it too. The shift in the air, the way the forest seemed too quiet. Hours passed. Then, just as the fire started to die down, we heard it. A snap, a crunch. Closer this time. My boss reached for his knife. I already had mine in hand. Something moved beyond the trees, just out of sight. Then, another sound, low, steady breathing. We weren't alone. I held still, my heart pounding. The breathing was too deep for an animal, too controlled. Then, just like the night before, it stopped. Nothing. We waited, listening. The silence stretched long, too long. Finally, after what felt like hours, my boss muttered under his breath and threw another log onto the fire. Neither of us slept that night. To first light, we packed up. Neither of us said it, but we both knew we weren't staying another night. As we loaded the truck, my boss stopped. There, in the dirt just beyond our camp, were footprints. Barefoot, human, leading right up to our tent. My stomach dropped. They hadn't been there the night before. Someone had been watching us while we slept. We didn't speak the whole drive back. I never went camping after that. I was never one for fancy hotels or big cities. I preferred being out in nature, away from noise and crowds, away from the artificial glow of streetlights and neon signs. That's why I decided to go camping alone in the French countryside one summer. I had planned everything carefully, mapping out my route, packing enough food, and choosing a quiet, isolated spot to set up my tent. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful trip. Just me, the forest, and the open sky. I arrived in the late afternoon, driving my old car down winding country roads. The campsite I had chosen was deep in a wooded area, far from any major towns. There were no official campgrounds, no facilities, just raw nature. I liked it that way. I parked at the edge of a dirt path and carried my gear deeper into the woods, searching for a good place to set up. After walking for about half an hour, I found a small clearing near a river. It was perfect. The ground was mostly flat, the trees provided plenty of cover, and the water source was close. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and got to work preparing my camp. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. As the sun dipped lower, I lit a fire and made a simple meal. The flames flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. The isolation was comforting at first. No distractions, no responsibilities, just me and the quiet. Then, as I sat by the fire, I noticed something strange. A faint path, barely visible, led away from my clearing deeper into the forest. It wasn't on the map. It looked old, overgrown, like it hadn't been used in years. I hadn't noticed it when I set up camp. Maybe I had been too focused on finding a good spot. I felt an odd unease creep over me. Something about the path didn't sit right. It was too narrow for vehicles, too hidden for regular hikers. It looked like a trail that had been forgotten or abandoned. I shook off the feeling. There were probably plenty of old trails in the area. Nothing strange about that. As night fell, I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled, and the distant flow of the river was steady and calm. I closed my eyes. Then, in the middle of the night, something woke me up. A sound, soft, faint, like footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. The woods were dark. The sound came again, slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal. Too steady, too controlled. I lay still, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to unzip the tent just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty. Nothing but trees and darkness. My firewood pile was untouched. My backpack still where I left it. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the forest settling, branches falling, an animal moving through the brush. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, everything seemed normal again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds chirped, and the river glistened in the daylight. The fear from the night before felt distant, almost silly. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. They weren't mine. I had been careful when setting up my tent, and my own tracks were clear. But these were different, larger, heavier, and they led from the overgrown path, stopping right in front of my tent before disappearing back into the woods. I stared at them, heart pounding. Someone had been here, watching, standing inches from where I had been sleeping. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a lost hiker, curious about my camp. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. A lost hiker would have called out. They wouldn't have stood there in silence. They wouldn't have turned back without a word. I decided to stay one more night. Maybe it was foolish, but I had come here for peace, and I didn't want to leave over some footprints. That evening, I made sure my fire was bigger, brighter. I set up a makeshift alarm, some empty cans tied to a string around my campsite. If anything moved through, I would hear it. Night came, the fire crackled, the forest stretched into darkness, and I sat there, listening. Then, just past midnight, the cans rattled. I jumped up, grabbing my flashlight. I shone it toward the path. Nothing. The trees swayed in the wind, but I saw no movement. No one. But I knew someone was out there. I stayed up the rest of the night, gripping the flashlight, waiting. The cans never rattled again. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up quickly, stuffing my tent and gear into my bag. I barely ate. I just wanted to get out. As I hiked back to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. But the woods were still. Then, as I reached my car and unlocked the door, I noticed something that made my hands shake. Scratches on the door, deep, uneven, like someone had dragged a knife or a sharp rock across the paint. And below the scratches, a single footprint in the dirt. Large, heavy, facing my car. I didn't wait. I got in, started the engine, and drove as fast as I could, watching the forest shrink in my rearview mirror. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing, I was never alone in those woods. I had always loved the outdoors. Camping, hiking, being alone in nature. It gave me a sense of freedom that nothing else did. The modern world was too noisy, too crowded. Out in the wild, away from the endless hum of cars and voices, I felt like I could breathe properly. I had traveled to Japan for work a few years ago and decided to stay. I worked as a freelance photographer, taking odd jobs here and there, mostly nature photography. My weekends were often spent camping in the countryside, exploring forests, climbing mountains, and finding those untouched places that few people knew about. One weekend, I set my sights on a remote camping spot in the mountains of Nagano Prefecture. I had read about it in an old hiking forum. Hardly any tourists, no maintained trails, just pure wilderness. That's exactly what I wanted. A real challenge. I packed light but smart. A tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, a knife, a flashlight, extra batteries, a small first aid kit, and enough food and water to last 3 days. I also carried a satellite GPS just in case, but I didn't plan on using it. I prided myself on my navigation skills. The hike to the campsite was long and difficult. The further I went, the more the landscape changed. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting in ways that made the forest feel ancient. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No distant sounds of traffic, no human voices. Just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. I set up camp in a small clearing near a stream. The ground was damp, but I found a dry enough patch for my tent. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped quickly. I boiled some water for instant noodles, ate while listening to the distant hoots of an owl, then crawled into my tent, exhausted. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something felt wrong. I wasn't sure why I had woken up. The forest was silent. Too silent. I had spent enough time camping to know that even at night, there was always some noise, crickets, the rustling of small animals, the occasional breeze shaking the trees. But now there was nothing. I lay still, listening. My tent was zipped up, and my sleeping bag was warm around me. I wanted to tell myself that I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I heard it. Faint crunch. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not the scurrying of a squirrel or the cautious steps of a deer. These were slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was walking nearby. I held my breath. The footsteps continued, circling my tent. Not too close, but close enough. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. I kept my breathing as quiet as possible. The footsteps stopped. Then, after what felt like hours, they started again, moving away this time, fading into the forest. I lay awake until dawn. Morning brought some relief, but I couldn't shake the unease. I stepped out of my tent and looked around. The ground was covered in fallen leaves and twigs, making it hard to spot footprints. But I knew what I had heard. I told myself it was probably another camper, maybe a hunter, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This place was too remote. I considered packing up and heading back early, but my pride wouldn't let me. I had come all this way, and I wasn't about to turn back because of some strange noise in the night. I spent the day exploring, taking photographs of the dense forest, the way the light filtered through the branches. But I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I wasn't alone. As the sun set, I built a small fire. The warmth was comforting, but the fire also made me feel exposed. I forced myself to eat. My appetite was gone, but I needed to keep my strength up. When I finally crawled into my tent, I made sure my knife was within reach. I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me. It was the feeling of being watched. I lay still, heart pounding. I listened, then movement. Something was just outside my tent. I slowly reached for my flashlight. I didn't turn it on yet. I wanted to be sure. A shadow moved. The fabric of my tent shifted slightly, as if something or someone had brushed against it. I flicked on the flashlight. Silence. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, shining my light into the darkness. Nothing, but the forest felt wrong. Then I saw it. Something was crouched low in the trees, just at the edge of the light. Not an animal, person. I couldn't make out their face, but they were there, unmoving, watching me. A cold wave of fear washed over me. My grip tightened on the knife. I didn't move. The figure didn't move either. Minutes passed. Then slowly they stood up. Even in the dim light, I could see how unnaturally long their arms were, how their posture was off. They turned and disappeared into the forest without a sound. I stayed awake until dawn again. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up. I didn't eat, didn't take any more photos. I just wanted to get out. The hike back felt different. The forest, once beautiful, now felt like it was pressing in on me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. At one point, I found something on the trail. A small wooden doll, handmade with twisted limbs and hollow eyes. I didn't touch it. I walked faster. It took me longer than expected to reach my car. By the time I saw it, my legs were shaking from exhaustion. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced that I would see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. I never went back to that place. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I camped after that, I made sure it was somewhere populated, somewhere with other hikers nearby. I still don't know who or what I saw that night, but I know one thing for certain. I was never alone in those woods, and whoever was out there, they had been waiting for me. That was an experience I'll never forget. Even now, years later, the memory of those footsteps, that figure in the dark, sends a chill down my spine. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some things are better left unseen. And sometimes, when you think you're alone in the wild, you aren't. The chopper blades cut through the night, slicing the cold air as we moved over the dense forest. The mission brief had been simple: retrieve the bodies of 2 missing reconnaissance operatives who had failed to report back from a routine scouting mission. No signs of struggle, no distress signals, just silence. Their last known coordinates placed them somewhere deep in the mountains, far from any known enemy movement or civilian paths. I sat in the dim red glow of the cabin light, my rifle resting between my knees. My squad, 5 of us in total, remained silent, checking our gear, securing straps, adjusting night vision. We all had our own thoughts about this mission, but no one voiced them. Something felt off about it. Routine missions don't send an entire special operations unit into the middle of nowhere. The pilot's voice crackled in my earpiece, informing us we had a few minutes before landing. I tightened my gloves, double-checked my gear, and took a deep breath. I had done dozens of these before, but something about this one felt different. The chopper descended, the wind kicking up dirt and loose leaves as the skids touched down on a small clearing. We moved out fast, securing the area, scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing. The forest swallowed the sound of the chopper as it lifted off, leaving us in total silence. We moved quickly, following the last known coordinates of the missing operatives. Thick branches clawed at our gear as we weaved through the dense trees, our boots sinking into the damp earth. The air smelled of pine and rotting leaves, the weight of the forest pressing down on us. After 2 hours of moving uphill, we reached a small plateau. The last radio ping had come from somewhere close to this location. I scanned the area through my night vision, my heart thudding. There was no sign of them, no footprints, no drag marks, nothing. Then we found their camp. A small, hastily assembled shelter sat in the middle of a clearing, just big enough for 2 men to huddle inside. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered by the wind. Their gear was still here: rucksacks, water bottles, extra ammunition. But no sign of them. I felt something tighten in my chest. They wouldn't have left their weapons behind. We spread out, searching for any signs of movement. The trees loomed over us, branches twisting into the night sky. I found one of their radios half buried in the dirt near a fallen log. No damage, no blood, just sitting there, abandoned. Then we saw the first sign of trouble. A trail of footprints leading away from the camp. Uneven, erratic, like someone was stumbling. We followed. The prints led us deeper into the woods, winding through dense undergrowth. The wind had picked up, carrying the sound of rustling leaves and shifting branches. The farther we went, the heavier the air felt, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. Then we saw it, the first body, slumped against a tree, half covered in leaves, eyes wide open. His rifle was still slung across his chest, his gear untouched. No wounds, no blood, just dead. I crouched next to him, checking for any signs of struggle. His face was frozen in an expression I couldn't place. Fear, pain, confusion. His skin was pale, his lips slightly parted as if he had been trying to say something when he died. Something was wrong. Soldiers don't just drop dead like this. No bullet wounds, no stab marks. We searched the body for any clues, notes, recordings, anything that could explain what happened. His comms unit was still on, but the battery was nearly drained. I signaled to the others. We needed to find the second body. Fast. We pressed on, moving slower now, more cautious. The second set of tracks led us farther into the woods, deeper into the unknown. The trees grew denser, the air colder. I felt it before I saw it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced at my squad. They felt it too. No one said a word, but our movements became sharper, our grips on our rifles tighter. Then we found the second body, lying face down near the edge of a small ravine, his gear scattered around him. Unlike the first, his body was twisted unnaturally, his arm bent at an impossible angle. His face was partially buried in the dirt, but his eyes were open, staring at nothing. I checked for wounds. Again, nothing. No bullet holes, no stab wounds. Just dead. Something wasn't right. Then we heard it. A noise. A rustling in the trees behind us. We turned as one, rifles up, scanning the darkness. Night vision painted the forest in shades of green, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But we knew something was there. The feeling of being watched turned to something worse. The wind had stopped. The trees had gone still. The forest, alive with sounds just moments ago, had fallen into complete silence. We had to move. We retrieved what we could from the bodies, their tags, their gear, anything that could be useful. But we weren't staying any longer than necessary. We moved fast, pushing through the undergrowth, retracing our steps back to the exfil point. Every muscle in my body was tense, my senses on high alert. Then the noise came again, closer this time, something moving through the trees, staying just beyond our line of sight. We picked up the pace, the weight of our gear pressing down on us as we ran through the forest. The air was thick, suffocating. Every step felt heavier, as if the woods themselves were trying to slow us down. The feeling of being watched never left. We reached the clearing just as the chopper came into view. The pilot must have sensed the urgency in our voices because the moment we broke through the tree line, the engines roared louder, ready to take off the second we were on board. I didn't look back as we lifted off. As we rose above the forest, I allowed myself to breathe. The others were silent, their faces pale. No one said a word. The bodies had no wounds, no signs of struggle. They had simply died, and something had been watching us. Back at base, the autopsies confirmed what we already knew. No wounds, no toxins, no signs of foul play. It was as if their hearts had just stopped. The official report listed it as unknown causes. No further investigation. We knew better. I still think about that mission, about those woods, about whatever was out there with us that night. And I know one thing for certain: we were not alone. I had always preferred camping alone. Some people found it strange, but for me, it was a way to clear my mind, to escape the noise of the city, to feel something real for a change. I didn't need the company of friends, didn't want the chatter or distractions. Just me, my tent, the trees, and the quiet. That year, I had picked a spot deep in the forests of Montana. It wasn't a popular campsite, which was exactly what I wanted. No marked trails, no designated fire pits, just raw wilderness. I had spent years honing my skills: fire making, tracking, finding clean water. I had everything I needed in my pack. The drive took most of the day, and by late afternoon, I found a clearing beside a slow-moving creek. The place felt perfect. The trees stood tall and thick, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. The ground was dry but soft, covered in layers of pine needles. No signs of recent human activity. No footprints. No trash. I set up my tent quickly. Years of doing this had made me efficient. The fire came next. I gathered dry wood, arranged it carefully, struck a match. Flames curled upward, warm and familiar. I cooked a quick meal, just beans and jerky. Simple. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept deeply, lulled by the distant sounds of an owl and the gentle rustling of the trees. The second day, I hiked. I didn't bring a GPS, just a map and compass. I liked relying on old methods. There was a ridge a few miles from my camp, and I wanted to see the view. The climb was slow but steady, and when I reached the top, I could see miles of untouched forest in every direction. No buildings, no roads, no smoke from other campfires, just endless green. I sat there for a while, enjoying the silence. It was on my way back that I noticed something odd. A tree, maybe 50 yards off my path, had deep gashes in its bark. Not claw marks, these were deliberate, straight cuts, as if someone had taken a knife or hatchet to it. They were fresh. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. There was no reason for those marks to be there. No reason for anyone to be out here carving into trees. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe a hunter had passed through recently, maybe marking a trail. Still, I walked back to camp faster than before, keeping my ears open. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every noise felt sharper, closer. The wind through the trees sounded like footsteps. The cracking of a branch made my pulse jump. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then, around midnight, I heard something. It wasn't the wind, wasn't an animal. It was the sound of metal, something tapping against something hard. Rhythmic, faint, tap, tap, tap. I lay still, listening. It sounded like it was coming from the trees. I reached for my knife. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see the edges of my tent. My ears strained, trying to pick apart the sound from the background noise of the forest. Tap, 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 then silence. I waited, my breath slow and controlled. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a falling branch, a loose piece of wood shifting in the wind. Still, I kept the knife close to my chest as I drifted into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I checked the area. I walked the perimeter of my camp, looking for footprints, disturbed earth, anything. Nothing. Maybe I really had imagined it, but something felt wrong. I decided to stay close to camp that day. I gathered more firewood, checked my gear, made sure everything was in order. By afternoon, the sky darkened. Clouds rolled in, heavy with rain. I prepared for a storm, tightening my tent, making sure my fire would stay dry. As evening fell, the rain came down hard. The fire sputtered but stayed lit. I ate quickly, then sat inside my tent, listening to the downpour. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. The rain drowned out most sounds, but that tapping was still there. Faint, persistent. I gripped my knife and waited. Then the tapping stopped, replaced by something worse. Breathing, not mine. It was close. I held my breath, every muscle tense. The rain beat against my tent, masking other sounds, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. There was someone out there, someone standing just beyond the firelight. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. Eventually, the rain eased and the breathing faded. I didn't sleep. At first light, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my gear quickly, barely stopping to eat. My instincts screamed at me to go, to get out of those woods. As I was about to collapse my tent, I saw them. Footprints, not mine. Fresh ones, circling my campsite. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my pack and started moving. I took a different route back to my truck, moving fast but quiet, checking my surroundings every few steps. The forest felt different now, no longer peaceful. Felt like something was watching me. Halfway back, I saw another tree with fresh marks carved into it. This time, there were more. Dozens of long, deliberate cuts. Some deep, some shallow. Not random, not an accident. I kept moving. The last stretch was the worst. My truck was parked on a dirt road, just out of sight beyond a thick patch of trees. As I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A single boot print, right next to my truck. Someone had been there. I didn't stop to check the rest. I threw my gear into the back seat, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. I just know that I wasn't alone, and that they had been watching me the whole time. It was a cold, wet evening when I set out into the woods. The rain had been falling on and off all day, leaving the ground soft and treacherous beneath my boots. I had planned this hunting trip for weeks, picking a remote spot in the Scottish Highlands where the forest stretched endlessly, untouched by towns or main roads. The isolation was perfect, and that was exactly what I wanted. I had arrived at my campsite earlier in the afternoon, just before the rain started. It wasn't much, just a small clearing with enough space for my tent, a fire pit, and a place to clean whatever I managed to hunt. The trees were dense around me, towering pines and gnarled oaks, their branches weighed down by the rain. The air smelled of wet earth, pine needles, and distant smoke from an unseen fire, though I was certain no one else was nearby. By the time the evening crept in, the rain had picked up again, a steady drizzle that made the undergrowth glisten under the weak light of my headlamp. The wind moved through the trees in a way that made the branches creak and groan, a sound that seemed amplified in the quiet of the forest. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, a reliable piece that had served me well in the past. Tonight, I was after deer if I was lucky. I moved carefully through the forest, my footsteps muffled by the dampness of the ground. The terrain was rough, uneven, with fallen branches and patches of thick mud that made every step uncertain. The deeper I went, the more I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. There were no distant howls, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, no chirping of insects. Just the sound of the rain tapping against the leaves and the occasional gust of wind. I had been walking for nearly an hour when I caught sight of something ahead, movement, just beyond the trees. My heart picked up as I crouched low, raising my rifle slightly, my breath slow and steady. Through the gaps in the branches, I saw a shape, a deer, standing completely still, ears twitching as if it had sensed something. I exhaled quietly and lined up my shot. Just as I was about to squeeze the trigger, the deer bolted, not away from me, but to the side, as if something had startled it. Something other than me. I stayed in my position, frozen, listening. For the first time since I had entered the woods, I felt something strange. A shift in the air, a heaviness that I couldn't explain. I wasn't superstitious, never had been, but there was an uneasiness settling into my gut that I couldn't ignore. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness behind me, my headlamp cutting weak beams through the trees. Nothing, just the rain, the trees, the wet ground. And yet, the feeling remained. I shook it off and started moving again, deciding to follow the deer's path. Maybe it had run to a more open area where I'd have a better shot. But as I walked, something gnawed at me. The way the deer had reacted, it wasn't normal. It hadn't just spooked. It had fled as if it had sensed something wrong. I pressed on, moving through the thick trees, stepping carefully over fallen logs and tangled roots. The rain had started to seep through my jacket, and the cold was settling into my bones. Every so often, I stopped to listen, straining to hear beyond the rain. Then I saw something. At first, it was just a glimpse, a shadow moving between the trees, barely visible in the dim light. I froze. My first thought was that it was another hunter, someone else out here in the middle of nowhere, but that didn't make sense. I had checked the area before I set up camp. There were no other cars, no signs of anyone nearby. I waited, breath held, watching. The shadow moved again, shifting behind a tree, disappearing for a moment before reappearing farther to the right. My grip on my rifle tightened. I wasn't alone. The rational part of my mind told me to call out, to announce my presence. Maybe it was a lost hiker, someone who had strayed too far from the trails. But the way it moved, it wasn't right. Too smooth, too controlled. Not the aimless wandering of someone lost. I took a step back, my boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. The shadow stopped. It was watching me. A shiver crawled up my spine. I had been hunting for years, spent countless nights in the wilderness, but this was different. There was something deliberate about the way it was standing there, just beyond the reach of my light. I slowly raised my rifle, not aiming, just letting whoever or whatever. It was know that I was armed. The shadow didn't move. For what felt like minutes, we stood there, locked in that moment, the rain falling between us, the wind rattling the trees. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the woods. I exhaled, my breath shaky. Every instinct told me to follow, to see what it was, but another part of me, the part that had kept me alive all these years, told me to go back to camp. I listened to that second instinct. I moved quickly, my eyes scanning every shadow, my ears straining for any sound beyond the rain. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me, and every time I turned, I half expected to see that figure again, standing just out of reach. By the time I reached my camp, the fire had nearly died, reduced to a few glowing embers. I threw more wood on, the flames crackling to life, pushing back the darkness. I stood there for a long time, rifle in hand, listening. Nothing. The rain eventually slowed, becoming a light drizzle. I forced myself to eat, to regain some of the energy I had lost, but my appetite was gone. My mind kept replaying what I had seen, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was another hunter after all. Maybe it was just some drifter, someone passing through the woods. But the way it had moved, the way it had watched me, it wasn't right. I didn't sleep much that night. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me gripping my rifle, my heart pounding. But nothing came. By morning, the rain had stopped, and the forest looked different in the daylight. Less threatening, more familiar. But the feeling lingered, that sense that something had been out there with me. I packed up and left earlier than planned. I never went back to that part of the woods again. I always liked to camp alone. I know that sounds reckless to some people, but I liked the quiet. It was peaceful. No city noise, no constant buzz of people around me. Just trees, wind, and the sounds of whatever lived out there. I never went to crowded campgrounds or places with lots of hikers. I preferred remote spots, miles away from any main road. That was the whole point, to get away from everything. It was late September, somewhere in Montana, a place far enough off the grid that I had to drive miles down unmarked dirt roads just to get there. The air had that sharp bite that meant summer was gone for good, but it wasn't quite cold enough for snow yet, just crisp enough to need a fire at night. Perfect camping weather. I had found the spot on an old hunting forum. Someone had mentioned a remote valley with good fishing and hardly any visitors. No official campsites, no trails leading to it. Just a small river, thick pine trees, and a clearing large enough to pitch a tent. That was all I needed. I packed light. A tent, sleeping bag, food for a few days, and my rifle. I always brought one. Not because I expected trouble, but because you never know. The first night was calm. The kind of stillness you only get in places that are truly empty. I set up my tent near the river, built a fire, and cooked a simple meal. The wind moved through the trees, and I could hear the faint sound of water flowing over rocks. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no signs of anyone. I liked it that way. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling off. I didn't know why at first. Something just felt wrong. The fire had burned down to embers, barely giving off any light. I listened. The usual nighttime sounds were gone. No crickets, no rustling from small animals, just silence. I reached for my rifle and sat up. The air felt thick, heavy in my lungs. I listened harder, trying to pick out anything in the dark. And then, just at the edge of my hearing, I caught it. A single footstep, not an animal, not something on four legs. A slow, deliberate step on dry leaves. I gripped my rifle tighter, scanning the dark. My fire had burned too low to see much beyond a few feet. I thought about grabbing my flashlight, but I didn't want to give away my exact position. Instead, I just sat there, barely breathing, waiting. Nothing. Minutes passed. No more footsteps. No sounds at all. Just that thick, unnatural silence. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe I had imagined it. I didn't go back to sleep, though. I just sat there, gripping my rifle until the first light of dawn. Day 2 was normal, almost too normal. The woods were quiet, but not in an eerie way. Just peaceful, the way they were supposed to be. I spent the day fishing, cooking, enjoying the solitude. By the time night fell, I had almost forgotten about the footsteps. Almost. That second night, I slept with my rifle next to me, just in case. And then, around midnight, I woke up again. The fire was still going this time, throwing flickering light onto the trees. The wind had picked up a little, making the branches sway. And then, just like the night before, the sound stopped. No insects, no movement, just that same unnatural silence. And then, a footstep. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating the underbrush. Nothing. Then, another step. Closer this time. I swung the light toward the sound, and for the briefest second, I saw something move. A shadow, just beyond the reach of the beam, ducking behind a tree. It was close. Too close. I stood up slowly, keeping my rifle in one hand and the flashlight in the other. My heart was pounding. Bear, I thought. No, a bear would make more noise. It wouldn't try to stay hidden. This was different. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, light scanning the trees, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. Eventually, the wind picked up again, rustling the branches, bringing back the normal sounds of the woods. And I stood there, feeling like an idiot, probably just an animal, my imagination running wild. But I didn't sleep much after that. By the third day, I had decided to leave early. I wasn't scared, exactly, but something didn't feel right. And when you're alone that far out, you don't ignore gut feelings. I packed up camp as the sun set, figuring I'd hike back to my truck and sleep there. It was a long walk, but I'd rather spend a few hours hiking in the dark than another night out there. The first hour was fine. The trail back was rough, just barely visible in the moonlight, but I knew the way. I moved fast, trying to cover as much ground as possible. Then, about halfway back, I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me, matching my pace. I stopped. They stopped. I started walking again. A few seconds later, another step. Not an animal. Not random sounds. Someone was following me. I gripped my rifle tight and turned fast, aiming into the darkness. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. But I knew I wasn't alone. I moved faster, almost jogging now. The footsteps behind me picked up speed too. Not running, just keeping pace. Always staying just out of sight. I forced myself not to panic. The truck wasn't far, just a little farther. Then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it. A figure, standing in the path ahead. Not moving. Just standing there, waiting. I stopped cold. My heart was hammering. I couldn't see details in the dark, but I could tell it was a person. They didn't move. I raised my rifle, aiming right at them. My hands were steady, but I could feel my breath shaking. Still, they didn't move. For a long moment, neither of us did. Then, just as my finger tightened on the trigger, they stepped back, melting into the trees without a sound. I didn't wait. I ran. I sprinted the last stretch of the trail, my legs burning, lungs aching. I didn't care about noise anymore. I just needed to get out. When I finally saw my truck, parked where I had left it on the dirt road, I almost collapsed with relief. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine so fast my hands barely worked. As my headlights flicked on, I saw something in the trees. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the light, watching. I didn't stick around to see what they'd do next. I gunned the engine and got the hell out of there. I don't know who or what I saw out there, but I haven't been back since. And I never camp alone anymore. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stupidity. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. I'd been on a handful of camping trips before, real camping out in the woods, far from civilization. But this was different. Camping in a graveyard was a whole other thing. It was my idea, or maybe half of mine. I'd always been drawn to places people avoided, not for thrills or some sick fascination, but because I liked the quiet. I liked the stillness of places people left behind. A graveyard at night, that was the purest form of silence. I picked a place far from town, an old burial ground in the countryside. It wasn't one of those well-kept cemeteries with fresh-cut grass and polished tombstones. This place had been abandoned for years. Overgrown weeds covered the ground. Headstones leaned at odd angles, and rusted iron fences marked the perimeter. Place long forgotten. The drive took nearly 2 hours. A narrow dirt road led up to the site, the path barely visible through the trees. My truck bounced over potholes, the tires kicking up dust. The sun was already dipping below the horizon when I arrived. I pulled up near a crumbling stone wall and killed the engine. The silence was immediate. No wind, no birds, just stillness. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and looked around. The graveyard wasn't huge, maybe an acre or two. Some of the graves were old, so old the names had worn off. Others had metal plaques instead of stones, rusted beyond recognition. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, grabbed my tent, and started walking. I didn't set up camp near the graves. That would have been disrespectful, even for me. Instead, I found a small clearing near the tree line, just outside the cemetery's edge. The ground was uneven, covered in dead leaves and tangled roots, but it would do. I pitched my tent, got a small fire going, and sat back as darkness settled in. The first hour was peaceful. I ate a sandwich, sipped some water, and leaned back against a fallen log. The sky was clear, the stars bright. The graveyard was barely visible in the fire's glow, just rows of dark shapes in the distance. I should have felt uneasy, but I didn't, not yet. That changed when I heard the first sound. It wasn't an animal. I knew the sounds of the woods: raccoons, foxes, deer moving through the underbrush. This was different. A single, deliberate step, like a boot pressing into soft earth. I sat up, my body tense. I listened. Nothing, just the crackling of the fire. I scanned the tree line, the gravestones. Nothing moved. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to relax, but I kept my head on a swivel. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and swept the beam across the graveyard. The headstones cast long shadows, but nothing stood out. The old rusted fence was still. The trees were still, but the feeling had changed. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy.
Obidza.
Like something was waiting. I stood up, gripping the flashlight tight. My breath was slow, controlled. It's nothing, I told myself. Just your mind playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I moved toward the cemetery, not deep inside, just a few steps past the first row of graves. The air smelled different here. Damp earth, rotting leaves, something stale. The flashlight's beam wobbled slightly in my hand. I scanned the ground, the headstones. Nothing. Then I saw it. Footprints. Fresh ones. They led from the edge of the graveyard toward the center. The grass slightly flattened, the dirt disturbed. I crouched down, running my fingers over the impressions. They weren't deep, whoever made them wasn't heavy, but they were recent. I followed them, slowly. My footsteps were the only sound. The fire crackled in the distance, but it felt far away now. The footprints weaved between the graves, disappearing into the overgrowth. I shined the light ahead, scanning the area. Then something moved, just a shadow, a shift in the darkness. My heart thumped against my ribs. My grip on the flashlight tightened. I raised it higher, the beam shaking slightly. Nothing, just stones and weeds. But I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't alone. I backed away, moving slowly, keeping the light ahead of me. The feeling of being watched was suffocating now. My pulse hammered in my ears. My foot hit something, a loose chunk of stone, and I stumbled. The flashlight jerked, the beam cutting across the graves. And that's when I saw him, a man, standing near an old, crumbling mausoleum. He wasn't looking at me, not directly. He stood still, his head slightly tilted. His clothes were dark, ragged, blending into the night. He was just there, standing in the graveyard like he belonged. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. Then, slowly, he took a step forward. I turned and walked away, not running, not making a sound, just moving. Fast. My legs felt numb, my hands cold. The fire flickered ahead, a small beacon in the darkness. I kept my ears open, listening. Footsteps, following me. I reached my tent, grabbed my knife from my backpack, and stood by the fire. The heat licked at my skin, but I barely felt it. I kept my back straight, my grip tight. My flashlight was still on, aimed toward the graveyard. Nothing. The man was gone, but I knew he was still there, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, scanning the dark. Every rustle of leaves made my muscles tighten. Every shift of the wind made my fingers clench. By the time the sun rose, I was already packing. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about taking my time. I tore down my tent, stuffed everything into my backpack, and got the hell out of there. As I drove down the dirt road, my hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. My body was stiff, my mind fogged with exhaustion. But one thought was clear. I wasn't alone in that graveyard. Someone else was there. Someone who didn't want me to leave. Someone who waited in the silence, watching. I never went back. I never will. And I still don't know if he followed me home. I had been looking forward to the hunting trip for weeks. The plan was simple. Drive out to a secluded area in the French countryside, deep in the forest, where hunting was permitted, and spend a few nights camping while tracking deer. It was late autumn, the days were short, and the air had a crisp chill that only grew sharper at night. Perfect weather for hunting, though it also meant the nights would be cold. I had hunted before, but never alone. This was my first solo trip, and I wanted the experience. Something about being out there with no one else, relying on my own skills, felt like a challenge I needed. I packed my gear carefully, my rifle, plenty of food, extra layers of clothing, a good tent, and enough supplies to last at least 4 days. The drive took me deep into the countryside, away from the small villages and into the wooded areas where the roads narrowed and the trees seemed to press in from all sides. I had studied the map beforehand and knew where I wanted to set up camp, an area near a clearing where deer often passed through. There was no phone signal this deep in the forest, but I was prepared for that. By the time I arrived, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. I parked my truck off the dirt trail, making sure it was hidden from view in case any authorities came through. Hunting was legal here, but I still didn't want to draw unnecessary attention. I took my gear and hiked about 1 kilometer into the woods until I found the clearing I was looking for. It was a good spot, flat ground, soft earth for the tent stakes, and plenty of tree cover to keep me hidden. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and prepared a simple meal from the supplies I brought. The air was still. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. It felt peaceful, exactly how I had imagined it. As darkness fully settled in, I decided to turn in early. I wanted to be up before dawn to start tracking. I put out the fire, zipped myself into my tent, and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, not sure why. The forest was silent, too silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just stillness. That wasn't normal. Even at night, the forest is alive with sounds. I listened carefully, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. A single, deliberate snap of a twig. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Maybe 20 or 30 meters away. Could be an animal, I told myself. But something about it felt wrong. I stayed completely still, listening. Nothing else followed. No movement, no other sounds. After a while, I convinced myself it was just a deer moving through the underbrush and went back to sleep. The next morning, I was up before the sun. The forest was back to normal. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, everything how it should be. I felt stupid for getting worked up over one little sound in the night. I packed up my gear, took my rifle, and started tracking. The morning air was cool, my breath visible in the crisp light. I moved slowly, carefully watching for tracks or signs of movement. After a few hours, I spotted a set of fresh deer tracks leading deeper into the woods. I followed them for nearly an hour before I finally saw it. A large stag standing in a small clearing, grazing. I raised my rifle, steadied my aim, and just as I was about to fire, something made me hesitate. The deer suddenly lifted its head, ears alert, eyes wide. It wasn't looking at me. It was looking past me into the trees behind me. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding. What had startled it? Then, In an instant, the deer bolted, vanishing into the trees. I turned around quickly, scanning the forest behind me. Nothing, just trees and shadows. But the feeling that something had been there, that something had scared the deer away, lingered. I decided to head back to camp. That night, I built a bigger fire. I wasn't sure why, but I felt uneasy. I cooked another simple meal and sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to shake the feeling. The forest was quieter than the night before. Not silent, but quieter. Then, as I was eating, I heard it again. The same sound as the night before, a single twig snapping somewhere in the distance. I stopped chewing, listening. Then another snap, closer this time. I slowly reached for my rifle, keeping my movements quiet. The fire flickered, casting long shadows against the trees. Then I saw it, a figure, a dark shape standing just at the edge of the firelight. I couldn't make out any details, but it was tall, human-shaped, not an animal. I raised my rifle, not aiming directly at it, but ready. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it moved back into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. The first light, I packed up my gear. I wasn't staying another night. I hiked back to my truck as fast as I could without making it look like I was running. When I got there, I threw my gear into the back and started the engine. Relief washed over me as I drove away from the campsite, leaving the woods behind. But as I reached the main road, I looked in my rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw something standing at the tree line, watching me leave. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just kept driving, and I never went hunting alone again. I always preferred being alone in the woods. The silence, the way the trees swallowed up the sound of the world. It was the kind of peace I needed. I wasn't some weekend camper who did it for fun. It was a way of life for me. I had spent years logging, hunting, and living deep in the forests of British Columbia. I knew the land better than I knew any city. I trusted my instincts, and I never took stupid risks. That's why, even now, thinking back to that night, I still don't know what to make of it. It started the same way every trip did. I loaded up my truck with my usual gear, tent, hatchet, rifle, enough supplies to last a week. I didn't bother telling anyone where I was going. No one would care anyway. It was early October, cold enough at night to remind you winter was coming, but not so bad that I needed anything more than my standard gear. I had picked a new spot this time, farther north, away from any trails or logging roads. I drove as far as my truck would take me before the road turned into a mess of overgrown brush. From there, I hiked. I followed an old game trail for miles, pushing deeper into the forest, the weight of my pack settling into my shoulders. The farther I went, the quieter it got. No sounds of passing cars, no hum of distant towns. Just the wind moving through the branches and the occasional rustle of something unseen in the undergrowth. That was what I liked most about places like this. You could feel the world stretching out around you, empty and endless. It made you pay attention. By late afternoon, I found a good spot. A small clearing next to a creek, surrounded by thick pines. Perfect. I dropped my pack, set up my tent, and got a fire going before the sun started dipping. As I worked, I kept an eye on the woods around me. Not because I was scared, just cautious. I'd seen plenty of black bears and cougars in my time, but I knew how to handle them. The first thing that felt off was the quiet. I don't mean the normal quiet you get deep in the woods. This was different. There were no birds, no insects, no sounds at all except for the wind. That was unusual, but I brushed it off. Sometimes nature just went still for a while. I spent the next hour splitting some wood and cooking a simple meal. The fire crackled, casting long shadows against the trees. It should have been comforting, but something about the way the darkness pressed in around the light made my skin prickle. I caught myself glancing up more than once, scanning the tree line. By the time I finished eating, the unease hadn't gone away. I told myself I was just on edge because it was a new spot. I buried the feeling and focused on my routine, cleaning up camp, checking my gear, making sure my rifle was loaded and within reach. That was when I noticed it. Bare footprints in the dirt. At first, I thought I had stepped there myself, but when I leaned in closer, I saw the shape of toes, the deep impressions of heels. They were fresh, and they weren't mine. I straightened up slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just darkness and the quiet hum of the creek. My fire popped, sending a spray of embers into the air, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Someone had been here. I hadn't heard them, hadn't seen them, but they had been close enough to leave tracks just outside my camp. And the worst part? They were barefoot. I listened hard, trying to pick out any sound beyond the fire. The wind had died down completely now, leaving the world in absolute silence. My gut told me to leave, to pack up and hike back to my truck. But my pride wouldn't let me. I wasn't some greenhorn scared of the woods. So I sat down by the fire and waited. The hours stretched on. The fire burned low, crackling in the quiet. Every so often, I'd shine my flashlight into the trees, but I never saw anything. By the time midnight rolled around, I was exhausted. I told myself that whoever had been out there was long gone, probably just some lost hiker. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and laid my rifle beside me. Sleep didn't come easy, but eventually I drifted off. Then I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had pulled me out of sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the camp in near total darkness. I lay still, listening. That was when I heard it. A soft, slow breathing. Not mine, not an animal's. It was coming from just outside the tent. I reached for my rifle, moving as quietly as I could. The breathing didn't stop. It was steady, slow, like someone standing just inches from the fabric. I held my breath, my finger resting on the trigger. If they moved, if they so much as touched the tent, I'd fire. But they didn't. They just stood there. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. My muscles burned from staying still so long. Then, just as slowly as it had come, the breathing faded. The silence returned. I didn't move. I didn't dare. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I slipped back into a restless sleep, my rifle still clutched in my hands. By morning, the tracks were gone. The ground around my tent was undisturbed. No signs of anyone having been there. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up camp in record time, my gut screaming at me to get out of there. As I hiked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors out of instinct. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. As I pulled onto the old logging road, I caught one last glimpse of the tree line in my mirror, and that was when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees, not moving, not waving, just watching. I floored it, speeding down the road. The image burned into my mind. I never went back to that spot. I never camped that deep in the woods again. And to this day, I still don't know who or what I saw out there. All I know is that some places aren't meant to be found, and some things aren't meant to be understood. I never should have agreed to that night shift. It was late September, and I had taken on a security job watching over a construction site near a wooded area in northern Washington. Some company was building a few cabins out there, and since they weren't finished yet, they needed someone to make sure no one messed with the equipment. I wasn't exactly thrilled about camping out in the cold for the night, but the pay was decent, and I figured it wouldn't be too bad. Sit in a tent, keep an eye on things, get paid. Easy enough. The job site was about 5 miles off the main road, tucked into the trees. The crew had already put up a few basic structures, just empty shells of cabins with no windows or doors yet. There were some stacks of lumber, a few locked toolboxes, and one of those big orange generators sitting in the middle of it all. Not much to protect, but enough to make it worth hiring a night watch. The boss told me no one had ever messed with the site before, but he still wanted someone there just in case. I was given a camping tent, a flashlight, a radio to call in if something happened, and a basic schedule. Check the area every couple of hours, make sure nothing was stolen or damaged, and stay awake until morning. Simple. At first, it didn't seem so bad. The sun was setting when I got there, casting long shadows through the trees. The sky was already thick with clouds, and the air smelled like rain. The kind of heavy, wet air that makes your clothes feel damp even before the storm starts. I set up my tent near the cabins, close enough to the generator that I could hear its low hum. The place was dead quiet otherwise, just the sound of wind moving through the trees. By the time it was fully dark, the rain had started. It wasn't a light drizzle. It was the kind of rain that soaks everything in seconds. Thick, heavy drops hammering against the ground, turning the dirt to mud. The wind picked up too, making the trees creak and sway. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and checked my watch. 9:30 p.m., just a few more hours to go. I did a quick walk around the site, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing. No tracks. No movement. Just rain bouncing off the ground. The forest was thick, but even through the gaps in the trees, I couldn't see any lights from nearby roads or houses. I was completely alone out there. I went back to my tent, trying to get comfortable on the camping cot. The rain wasn't letting up, and the sound of it against the fabric of the tent was deafening. Every gust of wind made the walls shudder. I checked the radio, still working. I had nothing to do but sit there and listen to the storm. Then I heard something. It was faint, barely audible over the rain, but it was there. A sharp, snapping sound, like a branch breaking, came from somewhere past the cabins, deep in the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold rain. Shining the light in the direction of the noise, I saw nothing but trees. I told myself it was probably just the wind knocking something over. Maybe an old branch finally giving out under the weight of the rain. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting, but nothing else happened. I went back to the tent, shaking off the water. My clothes were already soaked, and my boots were caked with mud. I sat down, trying to dry my hands on my jacket. I told myself to stop jumping at shadows. It was just the storm. But then it happened again. Another snap, louder this time. Closer. I shot up, grabbing my flashlight again. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The rain had let up just a little, and in the dim light from the generator, I could make out the silhouettes of the cabins. Beyond them, the woods stretched into darkness. I took a few steps forward, my boots sinking into the mud. I swept the flashlight over the tree line, scanning for movement. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Fresh ones, leading from the trees toward the cabins. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The prints were deep, meaning whoever made them was heavy. They weren't old. No water had pooled in them yet, meaning they'd been made after the rain started. Someone had been out there. I turned, shining my light over the cabins, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the empty, unfinished structures, dark and silent. My heart was pounding. The only other set of footprints out here should have been mine. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, but these were human prints, clear as day. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I needed to check the site, I moved slowly, stepping between puddles as I made my way past the cabins. The rain had picked up again, making it harder to see. I kept my flashlight steady, scanning every inch of the site. Nothing seemed out of place. The generator was still running. The toolboxes were untouched. But the footprints, they didn't go back into the woods. They stopped near one of the unfinished cabins. I swallowed hard, stepping closer. The frame of the cabin was just a skeleton, wooden beams and half-finished walls.
No doors, no windows.
Just an empty shell. I took another step, shining my light inside. Something moved. It was fast, too fast for me to get a good look. A shadow shifting in the darkness. I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't alone. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing in the mud. My mind was racing. Who the hell was out here? A thief? A drifter looking for shelter? Then I heard breathing. Deep, slow breathing. Not mine. It was coming from inside the cabin. I took another step back, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, before I could react, something darted out from the side of the cabin. A man. I barely saw his face before he was gone, sprinting into the trees. He moved fast, vanishing into the darkness before I could even think to chase him. I stood there, chest heaving, trying to process what I'd just seen. He had been watching me. I don't know for how long, but he had been out there in the rain, hiding, waiting. I wasted no time. I ran back to my tent, grabbed the radio, and called it in. My hands were shaking as I gave my location, telling them someone had been on site. They sent a patrol car. By the time the officers arrived, the man was long gone. They searched the woods but found nothing. No sign of him, no tracks leading away. Just the deep footprints near the cabins, proof that he had been there. I packed up and left that night. I didn't care about finishing the shift. I wasn't going to sit out there alone, waiting to see if he'd come back. I never took another job like that again, and I never found out who he was. All I know is that he was out there in the rain watching, and I never heard him coming. I had never been one to dwell on the past, but some wounds never fully heal. My ex-wife, Claire, and I had been divorced for almost 5 years before she passed away. It wasn't unexpected. She had been sick for a long time, and by the end, she was more like a memory than a real person in my life. But when I got the call that she was gone, I felt something shift inside me. It had been a long year since then, and I hadn't done much with myself. My job was the only thing keeping me grounded, but outside of that, I had stopped making plans, stopped seeing friends, stopped doing anything that required real effort. I needed to get out of my head, away from everything, and back into the world. That was why I found myself driving up a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, heading toward a place I had only heard about in passing, Dead Lake. It wasn't really called that. The real name was something generic, but over the years, locals had started calling it Dead Lake because nothing ever seemed to live in it. No fish, no birds, not even insects buzzing along the shoreline. People still camped there, but it was never crowded. The land was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, and far enough from town that if you didn't bring what you needed, you weren't getting it. It was perfect. The road leading to the lake was rough. The truck rattled over uneven dirt, tires slipping against loose gravel. I had left town behind nearly an hour ago, and the last sign of civilization had been an old, boarded-up gas station about 10 miles back. I finally reached the entrance to the campground. There was no ranger station, just a weathered wooden sign with half the letters chipped away, barely visible through the overgrowth. The trees around me were thick, old, and untrimmed. Felt like nature was reclaiming the place. I pulled into an empty clearing near the water and stepped out. The air was still, heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The lake stretched out in front of me, dark and unmoving.
No ripples, no reflections.
Just black water against a gray sky. I grabbed my gear from the truck and started setting up camp. The tent went up first, then the fire pit. I stacked enough wood to last the night and took out my cooler. The quiet was unsettling. I hadn't seen another car on the way in, and I doubted anyone else would be camping here. That suited me fine. I spent the next couple of hours walking along the shoreline. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and patches of thick mud. The deeper into the trees I went, the quieter it became. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the damp earth. There was something unnatural about the silence. I wasn't afraid, but my skin prickled. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. As the sun dipped lower, I made my way back to camp. I built the fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat in my camping chair, staring into the flames. The night air was colder than I had expected, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. Then I heard it, a sound from the trees. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire. A rustling noise, slow and deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal. Animals move with purpose, quick and skittish. This was different. I turned my flashlight toward the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but twisted branches and undergrowth. The sound stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. The fire popped, sending embers into the air. I let out a slow breath and sat back down. Then it started again, closer this time. I stood up, shining the light into the trees again. My heartbeat was steady, but my muscles were tense. Something was watching me. I scanned the tree line. The flashlight beam wobbled slightly in my hand. Then, just for a second, I saw something. A shape, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. I froze. The figure didn't move. It was tall, thin, almost blending into the trees. No features.
No color.
Just a shadow against the darkness. I blinked, and it was gone. I exhaled slowly and lowered the flashlight. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I sat back down, keeping the flashlight close. The night dragged on. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. But nothing else happened. No more sounds. No more figures. Just the cold wind whispering through the trees. Morning came slowly. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air was damp with mist. I stretched, my muscles sore from a restless night. I decided to pack up. Something didn't feel right. The silence, the shadow, the feeling of being watched. It was enough. As I loaded the truck, I glanced back at the lake one last time, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, not mine, fresh ones, leading from the tree line to the edge of my camp. They were deep, pressed into the damp soil. Someone had been standing there, watching me. I swallowed hard and got into the truck. The drive back felt longer than the drive in. Every turn in the road, every shadow between the trees, made my skin crawl. I didn't relax until I saw the first sign of civilization, an old diner off the highway. I pulled into the parking lot and sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the wheel. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I won't be going back to Dead Lake. I've always loved the outdoors. Camping, hiking, just being away from everything. It clears my head. But after what happened a few years ago, I can't bring myself to go deep into the woods alone anymore. Not after that night. It was late summer when I decided to take a trip to a remote camping spot in Oregon. I had heard about it from an old coworker, a place way off the main trails where you wouldn't see another person for miles. It sounded perfect. I was dealing with a lot at the time, work stress, personal issues, and I wanted space to think. I planned for a full week, bringing my tent, food, extra clothes, a good knife, and my hunting rifle. I had been camping all my life, and I knew how to prepare for anything the wild could throw at me. The drive took most of the day. I followed an old dirt road for miles, the trees growing thicker as I went deeper. My truck bounced on the uneven path, dust kicking up behind me. The last stretch of the drive was the worst. Barely a road at all, just an overgrown trail leading to a small clearing. I parked and stepped out, breathing in the fresh air. It was silent except for the wind moving through the trees. No traffic, no voices, no distractions. I spent the first day setting up my campsite. The clearing was perfect. Flat ground, plenty of space for my tent, and close enough to a small creek where I could get fresh water. I built a fire pit with some stones and gathered dry wood, stacking it neatly to the side. Everything felt right. The isolation didn't bother me. If anything, it was what I wanted. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I hiked during the day, following game trails through the woods, looking for signs of deer or other wildlife. I saw some tracks, but never anything close enough to take a shot at. At night, I sat by the fire, ate my meals, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The nights were cool, but my sleeping bag was warm. I slept well. Then came the 3rd night. Started small. I had just finished eating and was sitting by the fire, watching the flames flicker. The night was quiet, too quiet. I remember realizing that the usual sounds, the crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, were gone. It was just the crackling of my fire and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt it before I saw anything. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just darkness beyond the glow of my fire. I tried to shake it off. Being alone in the woods can play tricks on your mind, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I grabbed my rifle and stood up, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but branches and underbrush. I listened, holding my breath. Still nothing. After a while, I convinced myself I was overreacting and sat back down, but I kept the rifle close. It wasn't until later, when I was in my tent, that I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, careful steps moving through the underbrush. Not an animal. Animals don't move like that. It was deliberate. Someone was out there. I lay completely still, my heart pounding in my ears. The steps continued, circling the tent. Then they stopped. Silence. I reached for my rifle, my hand shaking slightly. Whoever it was, they were close. They had to see my fire earlier, see my truck parked nearby. But they hadn't announced themselves, hadn't called out. That wasn't normal. Minutes passed. Then, just as I started to think they were gone, I heard something new. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, just outside the tent. I gripped my rifle tighter, my finger near the trigger. I wanted to unzip the tent and shine my light, but a small part of me was afraid to see what was on the other side. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. The footsteps started again, moving away this time, fading into the woods. I stayed frozen, listening until I was sure they were gone. Then I sat up, my pulse still hammering in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had convinced myself that maybe it was just some drifter or another camper who got lost. Maybe they saw my fire and got curious. I didn't like it, but I told myself it was over. It wasn't. That evening, as the sun started setting, I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints. They were fresh, circling my campsite. And they weren't mine. Someone had been walking around my tent again while I was out hiking. Watching. I made my decision right then. I was leaving. I started packing my gear, throwing things into my backpack. I could be out by nightfall if I moved fast. But as I was stuffing my sleeping bag into its sack, I heard it. A whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. A human whistle came from the trees maybe 50 yards away. Then another, and another. 3 different whistles from 3 different spots. I wasn't alone. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to move calmly. I slung my pack over my shoulders, grabbed my rifle, and started walking toward my truck. I didn't run. I didn't want to look scared, but my legs were stiff, my body on high alert. The whistling continued. More voices, more places. They were following me. I reached the truck, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door. I threw my gear inside and started the engine. The headlights flooded the forest, and for the first time, I saw them. Figures. Tall, thin figures standing between the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. Watching. I didn't wait. I slammed the truck into reverse, spun around, and tore down the dirt road. Branches scraped against the sides, dust billowing in the headlights. I didn't stop until I hit pavement miles away. I never went back. I don't know who they were or what they wanted. I don't think I ever will. But I know one thing. They wanted me to stay just one more night. I had always loved the quiet of the wilderness. It was the one place where I could clear my head, away from the city, the noise, the routine of daily life. I wasn't new to camping either. I had spent years going on solo trips, learning the small details that made a difference out there. How to pack light but smart, how to keep a fire going even in damp conditions, how to move through the woods without making too much noise. I trusted myself in the wild. It was late September when I took this particular trip, a time of year when the air carried the first hints of the coming cold. I had chosen a spot deep in the national forest, somewhere in Pennsylvania. The place wasn't a well-known campsite, which was exactly why I had picked it. I wanted quiet, isolation. I had looked at a few maps, found a lake about 12 miles from the nearest road, and figured that was perfect. I drove as far as I could on the dirt road before parking my truck in a clearing. From there, I loaded my pack onto my back, secured my gear, and started hiking. The first few hours were peaceful. The trails were barely visible, just faint impressions where the ground had been disturbed by deer or the occasional hiker. The deeper I went, the less I saw of any human presence. I reached the lake by late afternoon. It was even better than I had hoped. Completely untouched, surrounded by dense forest with not a single sign of anyone having been there recently. I picked a spot near the water's edge, cleared a small area for my tent, and got to work setting up camp. I had brought a compact stove, but I still gathered some wood for a fire. Even if I wasn't going to cook on it, a fire always made a campsite feel more secure at night. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky shades of red and gold. I sat by the water, listening to the wind rustling the trees, the occasional splash of a fish. This was exactly what I needed. By the time it was fully dark, the fire was going strong, crackling and sending small embers into the air. I ate a quick meal, stretched out my legs, and leaned back against a log, just taking in the night. It was colder now, but my jacket and the fire kept me warm. Everything was perfect, until I noticed something. The woods had gone quiet. If you've spent enough time outdoors, you know how unnatural that is. Even at night, there's always something. A distant owl, the rustling of small creatures, the shifting of branches in the wind. But now there was nothing. The air was completely still. I sat up, suddenly alert. My eyes scanned the tree line, but in the firelight, all I could see were the dark silhouettes of trees stretching toward the sky. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it into the woods. Nothing. I listened for a long time, but the silence didn't break. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the way it sometimes does when you're alone in the dark. I tossed a few more logs on the fire, then crawled into my tent. Took me a while to fall asleep, but at some point, exhaustion took over. I woke up suddenly. Something had snapped outside my tent. I wasn't groggy. I was fully alert, my heart already pounding. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly as I listened. Another sound, a faint crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. My tent was zipped shut, but I could see the glow of the fire through the fabric. The flames had died down, leaving only a dim light flickering outside. Then I heard it, a low, deliberate exhale. Not an animal, person. Every muscle in my body tensed. I carefully shifted, reaching for my flashlight. My mind was racing. Who would be out here? This was miles from any trail, and I hadn't seen a single person since leaving my truck. I clicked the flashlight on, aiming it at the tent wall. The thin fabric glowed, but I didn't see a shadow. Whoever was out there was standing just outside the fire's reach. I took a slow, deep breath, then unzipped the tent in one quick motion. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees. Nothing. The fire cast long shadows, but there was no one in sight. I stepped out, knife still in my other hand. The forest stretched around me, dark and silent. I scanned the ground, no fresh footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. But I knew what I had heard. For the next hour, I sat by the fire, knife on my lap, flashlight in hand. The silence stretched on, unbroken. Eventually, exhaustion started creeping in again. I didn't want to go back into the tent, but I also couldn't stay up all night. I let the fire burn low, then forced myself to lie down. I kept the knife within reach. Sleep didn't come easy, but at some point my body gave in. Morning came slow. The first light seeped through the trees, and I sat up, my body sore from tension. The forest looked different in the daylight, less threatening, more familiar, but I still felt uneasy. I stepped out of my tent and froze. There, in the dirt near the fire pit, were footprints. Barefoot, human. They circled my campsite, stopping just outside my tent. I felt my stomach drop. Whoever had been out there last night had stood just inches away from me. Listening, watching. I packed up immediately. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to move fast. I wasn't going to stick around. By the time the sun was fully up, I had my gear strapped to my back, and I was hiking out. I didn't stop, didn't take any breaks. I just moved, fast and steady, my knife still in my hand the whole way. It took me hours, but eventually, I made it back to my truck. I threw my pack into the bed, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't relax until I was miles away, back on paved roads with other cars around me. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know how long they had been watching me before I woke up. I never went back to that spot. It was late September, and the days were getting shorter. The crisp air of early autumn clung to the mountains, and the scent of damp earth mixed with the faint smoke from a campfire. I had been planning this trip for weeks. A solo camping trip deep in the Oregon wilderness, far from the noise of the city, away from work, away from everything. I had always been comfortable in the woods. Growing up, my father took me hunting and camping every fall. He taught me how to track, how to read the land, how to move quietly, and how to listen. The forest had always felt safe to me, but this time something felt off from the start. I had chosen a remote spot near an old logging road, a good 15 miles from the nearest town. The drive-in was rough, the dirt road winding through dense pine and fir trees, climbing higher into the mountains. The last stretch of the road was barely maintained, with deep ruts and overgrown brush scraping the sides of my truck. Eventually, I found a small clearing near a slow-moving creek, perfect for setting up camp. I stepped out, stretched, and took a deep breath. The air was cold and damp, the way it always was before the first real snowfall. I started setting up camp, pitching my tent close to the tree line for wind protection. The ground was covered in fallen leaves and pine needles, damp but not soaked. After gathering firewood and setting up my small stove, I sat by the fire, eating a can of beans and watching the trees sway in the wind. That's when I noticed the silence. I'd been in the woods enough to know how they sounded. The distant rustling of squirrels, the occasional bird call, the creaking of branches. It was never truly silent. But now there was nothing. No wind, no movement, no sound at all except the soft crackling of my fire. I listened harder, trying to pick up any signs of life. But the only sound was my own breathing. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, the kind that set off something deep and instinctual in your brain, telling you that something wasn't right. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that I was just overthinking it. I finished my food, doused the fire, and climbed into my tent, zipping the flap tight. The cold seeped into my sleeping bag, and I pulled it tighter around me. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep, but something kept me awake, a nagging feeling, like I was being watched. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. A noise woke me, a soft shuffling sound, just outside my tent. My heart pounded as I lay still, listening. It wasn't the sound of a small animal, and it wasn't the wind. It was something larger, moving carefully, deliberate. I held my breath. Then I heard it again. A low, guttural breathing. Slow, steady, right outside my tent. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The breathing was too close, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I could hear the faint sound of something shifting its weight, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence returned. I waited, muscles tense, every nerve on edge. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Finally, I forced myself to relax, though my heart was still hammering in my chest. Maybe it had been a deer or a coyote. Maybe I was just on edge because of the unnatural silence earlier. I closed my eyes, gripping the knife under my sleeping bag, and eventually, sleep took me. The next morning, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The air was still, but the forest had come back to life. Birds chirped in the distance, and a squirrel darted up a nearby tree. I looked around, searching for any signs of what had been outside my tent. First, I saw nothing. Then, a few feet away, I noticed something strange. Prints in the dirt. They weren't boot prints, and they weren't from an animal, at least not one I'd ever seen. They were long, almost human, but with claw-like indentations at the tips of each toe. They trailed around my tent, stopping right outside where my head had been. A shiver ran down my spine. I crouched, examining them closer. The prints were deep, heavier than a normal footprint, as if whatever made them had been crouching, pressing down into the earth. Something had been watching me. I packed up my camp faster than I ever had before. My hands were shaking, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I wasn't alone. I threw my gear into the truck, slammed the door shut, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I backed out onto the dirt road, tires spinning in the soft earth. As I drove, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something step out of the tree line. But there was nothing. Just before I reached the main road, I spotted something in the trees. A figure, standing just at the edge of the forest. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long arms and legs. Its skin was pale, almost gray, blending into the misty morning light. I couldn't see its face. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I pressed the gas pedal down, speeding onto the paved road, not looking back. I never went back to that spot. I never told anyone what happened. But I know what I saw, and I know that thing, whatever it was watching me, waiting, and I don't think it wanted me to leave. I was never a fan of camping alone, but I had done it a few times before without trouble. I always chose familiar spots, places where I had camped before, where I knew the layout of the land and could trust my instincts. This time was different. I decided to go further than I usually would, deeper into the woods just to challenge myself. I wanted to disconnect from everything for a while, to clear my head. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me and nature. I picked a remote spot, miles from the nearest town. I parked my truck at the trailhead, packed my gear, and started hiking. The trail was rough, not well maintained, but I liked that. It meant fewer people came this way. The further I walked, the quieter it got. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the dirt, the occasional rustling of leaves, and the wind pushing through the trees. It took me a few hours to reach the clearing where I planned to set up camp. The spot was perfect, flat ground, a small creek nearby for water, and enough trees around to block the wind. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and made a small fire before the sun went down. It was peaceful, the kind of silence you only get when you're deep in the wilderness, away from everything. As the night settled in, I sat by the fire, ate my food, and let my mind wander. The woods had a way of making you feel like you were the only person left in the world. That's what I liked about it. But there was always that feeling in the back of my mind, that small, nagging thought that I wasn't actually alone. I heard movement in the distance. Not unusual. Animals were always out at night. It sounded like something walking through the brush. A deer, maybe. I didn't think much of it. But as the night went on, the sounds got closer. At first, it was sporadic, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Then it became more deliberate, like someone or something was moving with purpose. I shone my flashlight into the trees but saw nothing. The sounds stopped as soon as I did. That's when the unease set in. I had spent enough time outdoors to know the difference between normal animal sounds and something else. This wasn't normal. It felt off. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the darkness. I told myself it was just a deer, a curious raccoon, something harmless. But then I noticed something strange. The woods, usually alive with the sounds of insects and birds, had gone completely silent. It's something I had only experienced a few times before, and it always meant one thing: something was nearby. Something big enough or dangerous enough to make everything else go still. I listened carefully, barely breathing, and then I heard it. A long, slow exhale. Not from me, not from an animal. It was close. I didn't move. I didn't even turn my head. I just stared into the darkness, my mind racing. My gun was inside the tent. I cursed myself for not keeping it closer. My knife was on my belt, but that wouldn't do much if something really wanted to hurt me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The woods came back to life. The insects chirped again. The wind rustled the leaves. Whatever it was gone. At least I hoped it was. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, gripping my knife, listening. I waited for the sun to rise. When it did, I packed up my things and decided to cut the trip short. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to meet it. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every snap of a twig made my heart race. I felt watched. I didn't know if it was just paranoia or if something was actually following me. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. Then, just before I turned the key, I saw it, in the trees just beyond the edge of the clearing. A figure, standing perfectly still, watching me. I couldn't see details, just the shape of a person, half hidden in the shadows. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. I started the truck and drove, fast. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, surrounded by houses and streetlights. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing: I won't be going back to that place. Ever. It was the middle of summer when I made the mistake of setting up camp near an old, forgotten graveyard. I had been hiking for days, moving deeper into the countryside, avoiding crowded trails and sticking to back roads and forgotten paths. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. I had been dealing with a lot back home. Stress from work, the slow unraveling of friendships, and a nagging emptiness that I couldn't shake. So, I packed up my gear and set out alone, figuring some time in nature would clear my head. I didn't plan to sleep in a graveyard. That was never the goal. But as the sun started to dip behind the trees that evening, I realized I had misjudged my timing. I had spent too much time moving at a slow pace, taking in the quiet, and now I was running out of daylight. My map showed no official campsites nearby, and the nearest town was miles away. I needed to find a spot soon. I was walking along a dirt road when I spotted the entrance. It wasn't marked by any sign, just an old iron gate, rusted and leaning to one side, barely hanging onto the stone posts that framed it. Beyond the gate, there was a clearing, and at the far end, I could make out rows of crooked headstones, some standing tall, others leaning at odd angles. The graveyard was small, maybe only 100 yards across, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. The place looked abandoned, untouched by time except for the slow decay of stone and wood. There were no fresh flowers, no signs of recent visitors, just silence. It wasn't ideal, but it was flat ground, and it meant I wouldn't have to push further into the woods in the dark. I told myself it was just another clearing, just another piece of land like any other. The fact that it happened to hold old graves didn't matter. The dead didn't bother me. I climbed through the broken gate and walked to the far side of the clearing, where the ground was mostly clear of debris. I set my pack down and began setting up my tent. The fabric rustled loudly in the stillness. My movements felt exaggerated in the quiet, like I was disturbing something that had been left untouched for too long. Once my tent was up, I gathered some wood and built a small fire. The flames flickered weakly at first before catching properly, throwing light across the overgrown grass. The heat was a comfort, a reminder that I was still here, still part of the living world. I ate a quick meal, some dried meat and a few granola bars, then leaned back against my pack, staring up at the sky. The stars were sharp, undisturbed by city lights. The night air was still, with only the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. For a while, I felt at peace. The stress that had been eating at me back home seemed distant, unimportant. Then the feeling changed. At first, it was subtle, a creeping unease, a slight shift in the air, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I ignored it, chalking it up to my own nerves. It was just the setting getting to me, nothing more. But then I noticed the sounds, or rather, the lack of them. The wind had stopped completely. The trees no longer swayed. The usual night sounds, the chirp of insects, the distant call of an owl had gone silent. The air felt heavy, pressing in around me. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself to sleep. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, leaving only a small opening for ventilation. The fabric of the tent felt thin, barely a barrier between me and the world outside. I lay on my back, listening. Something moved outside. It wasn't loud, just the faintest rustling, like grass being disturbed. It could have been anything, a small animal, a bird shifting in the trees. I held my breath and listened harder. The sound stopped. Then, a moment later, it came again. Closer. Not an animal. The footsteps were too deliberate, too measured. They weren't coming from the trees. They were moving through the graveyard. I stayed still, barely breathing. My fingers tightened around the knife I kept by my side. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I waited, every muscle locked in place. Nothing happened. Minutes passed, then more. The weight in the air lifted slightly. The night sounds slowly returned. The whisper of wind, the hum of insects. I didn't move. I barely slept. Morning came slowly. The first light of dawn was weak, casting long shadows through the trees. I unzipped my tent carefully, scanning the area outside. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt. No sign that anyone had been near my tent. But as I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had overstayed my welcome. The graveyard felt different in the daylight, but the unease remained. I moved quickly, rolling up my sleeping bag, stuffing my gear into my pack. As I turned to leave, my eyes caught something near one of the older graves. A single boot print in the dirt. Too fresh, too deep. I didn't stay to examine it. I threw my pack over my shoulder and walked out through the broken gate, not stopping until I was miles away. I never camped near a graveyard again, and I never hiked alone after that. I've always liked being alone in nature. It's something about the quiet, the distance from the world, and the sense of being away from everything that makes camping one of my favorite things to do. I never cared much for busy campsites or places filled with people. I always preferred the isolated spots, the ones where you wouldn't hear another person for miles. It was late September when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. The summer warmth had faded, but the cold hadn't fully set in yet. It was the kind of weather where you needed a jacket at night but could get away with just a long-sleeved shirt during the day. I had planned to camp in a small wooded area in the Peak District, far from any towns or main roads. I packed light, just my tent, sleeping bag, some food, and a few essentials. The plan was to spend a couple of nights there, just relaxing, hiking a bit, and enjoying the quiet. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I wasn't expecting to find a body. The first day was normal. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my car a couple of miles from the area I had planned to camp in, and hiked in with my gear. The trees were tall and thick, the kind that blocked out most of the sky when you looked up. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and moss. I found a spot near a small clearing, just off a narrow dirt trail that seemed barely used. It was perfect, flat ground, a few fallen logs nearby for firewood, and no signs of anyone else around. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and sat back to enjoy the sounds of the forest. Birds, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. It was peaceful. That night, the temperature dropped more than I expected. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped up my tent, and tried to get comfortable. The forest felt different at night. The sounds seemed sharper, closer, but I wasn't worried. I had camped alone many times before, and the noises of the wild never bothered me. What did bother me, though, was the smell. At first, I thought it was just the damp earth, maybe rotting leaves or something nearby, but it was strong, too strong. It had a thickness to it, like something heavy in the air, a mix of dampness and decay. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just an animal that had died somewhere deeper in the woods. But the smell was there, clinging to the air, even as I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The fire had died out during the night, and the forest was covered in a thin layer of mist. I stretched, made some instant coffee on my small stove, and decided to explore a bit before breakfast. I hadn't gone more than 10 minutes from my campsite when I saw something unusual. The trees in this part of the woods were close together, their trunks thick and covered in patches of moss. The ground was uneven, with roots twisting up from the soil like veins. But in the middle of it all, just beyond a fallen tree, I spotted something that didn't belong. A shape. At first, I thought it was a pile of old clothes, maybe something a hiker had left behind. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a body. The smell hit me first, worse than it had been the night before. It was overwhelming, the kind that makes your stomach turn. The body was lying face down, partially covered by leaves and dirt. The clothes were dark, torn in places, stained with mud and something else. The arms were twisted at odd angles, like they had been broken. I stopped a few feet away, my heart pounding. I didn't want to get any closer, but my eyes kept scanning over it, taking in the details. The skin was pale, almost gray. The hair was matted, stuck to the scalp with dried blood. I didn't know how long it had been there, but it wasn't fresh. My first thought was to turn around, get out of the woods and call the police. But I had no signal. I had deliberately chosen a spot far from any roads, and now that decision didn't seem so smart. I forced myself to think logically. If I followed the trail back to my car, I could drive until I found a signal and call for help. It was the only option. I took one last look at the body, then turned and started walking back toward my campsite. My pace was quicker now, my breath uneven. I tried not to think about it, but my mind kept circling back. Who was he? How did he die? How long had he been out here? And then a worse thought crept in. Was someone else out here with me? As I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees felt taller, the shadows longer. Every small sound made my pulse jump. A twig snapping, a bird flapping its wings, my own footsteps crunching against the dirt. I told myself I was being paranoid, but paranoia or not, I wasn't staying another night. I shouldered my pack, doused the fire, and started hiking back toward my car. But then I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. I stopped cold, staring at them. The ground was damp, soft enough to leave clear impressions. These prints were fresh, deep, with edges still sharp. They led from the direction of the body, cutting across the path I had just walked. Whoever had left them had passed through here recently. Very recently. I didn't run, but I walked as fast as I could without making too much noise. My breath was sharp, my ears straining for any sound behind me. The woods felt different now, like they were pressing in, the trees closer together, the path longer than I remembered. When I finally saw my car, relief hit me like a wave. I yanked the door open, threw my pack inside, and started the engine. The sound of the motor felt too loud, echoing through the trees. I didn't waste time. I drove. Fast. I didn't stop until I had signal, until I could call the police. When they arrived, I led them back to where I had found the body. They marked off the area, examined the scene. But when they turned the body over, the look on the officer's face told me something was wrong. This wasn't an accident, he said. There were wounds on the man's chest, deep ones, like he had been stabbed again and again, and then left here alone to rot. I answered all their questions. They asked when I had arrived, if I had seen anyone else, if I had heard anything strange. But I hadn't, not until I had found the body, and not until I had seen those footprints. I never found out who he was, or why he had been killed. The police never told me if they found the person who did it. But for weeks after, I kept thinking about those footprints. They hadn't led away from the body. They had led toward my campsite. Whoever had killed that man had still been out there, and they had been watching me. I never went back to that spot, and I never camped alone again. I had always wanted to experience the Amazon in its rawest form. Not a guided tour, not a short jungle trek with a group, but real, deep, isolated camping. I wasn't reckless. I had years of experience with the wilderness, long hikes, solo camping in national parks, and even some survival training. But nothing could fully prepare me for the way the Amazon felt at night. The rain had been falling steadily since late afternoon. Thick, heavy drops slammed against the canopy above, breaking into smaller streams before soaking the jungle floor. I had found a relatively dry patch under a few towering trees, not far from a slow-moving river. The thick humidity made everything stick to my skin. The mosquitoes were relentless, even with repellent. I had set up my tent quickly, my hands moving from memory. It was a good tent, strong, waterproof, reliable. Still, the weight of the jungle around me made me uneasy. The Amazon wasn't like any other place I'd camped before. It felt alive in a way I couldn't quite explain. By the time darkness settled, the rain had turned into a steady downpour. The sound was deafening, but beneath it was an orchestra of noises I had never heard before. Chirps, growls, the distant scream of something deep in the forest. I sat inside my tent, eating a protein bar, my gear stacked neatly. My machete rested beside me, along with a flashlight and a backup battery. I didn't take any chances. I wasn't afraid, but I was on edge. The jungle was unpredictable. I had read stories of jaguars stalking camps, of snakes slipping into tents, of insects with bites that could take a man down in hours. I had planned for all of that, prepared myself mentally. But what I hadn't accounted for was the overwhelming sense of being watched. It started as a feeling, a pressure in my chest, a crawling sensation at the back of my neck. I forced myself to ignore it. Fear had no place here. I reminded myself that the jungle had its own rhythm, its own way of existing. I was just a visitor. Then something changed. A new sound, separate from the rain, separate from the hum of insects. A wet, heavy movement, close, too close. I froze, listening. It wasn't the rustling of a small animal. It was slow, deliberate, something moving through the undergrowth. My heart pounded. I reached for my machete. I strained my ears, waiting. The movement stopped. Silence except for the rain. I took a slow breath, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. An animal, maybe a tapir or a large rodent. Nothing to worry about. But I knew better. I had spent enough nights alone in the wild to recognize the difference between an animal passing through and something paying attention. I clicked on my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. Nothing but thick foliage, slick with rain. The jungle swallowed light, making it hard to see past a few feet. I waited, but the noise didn't return. Hours passed. The rain continued. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something just beyond the reach of my tent. I told myself it was paranoia. I told myself it was the Amazon playing tricks on me. Then I heard the breath. It was soft, almost hidden beneath the rain. But I knew what it was. It wasn't the short, erratic breaths of an animal. It was controlled, quiet, the kind of breathing a person makes when they don't want to be heard. I gripped my machete so tightly my hand ached. My mind raced. No one was supposed to be out here. I was miles from any village, deep in the jungle. I had made sure of that. I waited, forcing myself to stay still. The breath came again, closer this time. My tent was zipped shut, but I felt exposed, as if the fabric between me and the outside world was nothing more than a thin layer of false security. And then the worst sound of all, the zipper. It was faint, barely a shift, but unmistakable. Someone, something, had touched the entrance of my tent. I didn't hesitate. With one quick motion, I slashed outward with my machete, aiming at the sound. The blade sliced through fabric and met nothing but empty air. I scrambled out of the tent, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam in every direction. Rain pounded against my skin. My breath came fast and shallow. Nothing, just jungle. But I knew something had been there. The rest of the night was a blur. I sat outside, machete in one hand, flashlight in the other, waiting for something to return. But nothing did. The rain eventually let up, and the jungle returned to its usual chorus of sounds. But I never shook the feeling that something had been watching me. Something had tested the barrier between us. At first light, I packed up my camp and left. I didn't think. I just moved. The hike back to the nearest village was long, but I didn't stop. Every rustling leaf, every shift in the trees sent adrenaline through my veins. I didn't look back until I saw the first signs of human presence. Boats along the riverbank, the distant sound of voices. I never found out who or what had been there that night. Maybe it was a poacher, maybe a lost traveler, maybe something else. All I knew was that I had never felt fear like that before. The Amazon was wild, untamed. It was a place where humans didn't belong, and I wasn't about to test my luck a second time. I left and never returned. I don't go hunting much anymore. I used to, though. Spent whole weeks in the woods when I was younger. I liked being alone out there. Just me, my rifle, and the quiet. There was something about the way the world slowed down when you were tracking something. Every sound, every movement, every shift in the wind became part of the hunt. But that was years ago. I don't go anymore, and it's because of what happened in that valley. It was late October, years back. The air had that first real bite of winter in it, sharp enough to remind you that the season was changing. I had taken a few days off work, figured I'd head out to the woods and see if I could bring back some deer meat before the weather got too cold. I packed up my truck, double-checked my rifle, and drove out toward the mountains, heading for a spot I hadn't been to in a while. An old valley deep in the forest, far enough away that I wouldn't run into other hunters. I liked that about it. I didn't want to run into anyone. Hunting was something I did alone. The drive took most of the day, winding down gravel roads, past logging sites and empty fields, until finally, I reached the turnoff that led into the woods. From there, it was another hour on an old dirt trail, barely more than tire ruts cutting through the trees. The further I went, the rougher the road got, branches scraping against the sides of my truck, the ground uneven beneath the tires. Eventually, I reached a clearing where I always set up camp. I got out, stretched, and breathed in the cold air. It smelled like damp earth and pine. The sun was already low in the sky, painting everything in deep orange. I set up my tent, built a fire, and got my gear ready for the next day. I was planning to be out at dawn. That night, as I sat by the fire, I noticed how quiet it was. That wasn't too unusual. These deep parts of the forest got eerily silent sometimes, especially at night. No wind, no rustling in the underbrush, not even the usual distant hoot of an owl. Just silence. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too focused on my plans for the morning. I woke before sunrise, had a quick breakfast, and grabbed my rifle. The ground was covered in frost, crunching under my boots as I made my way into the trees. My breath came in white clouds. I spent the first few hours tracking. I found fresh deer sign near a narrow stream, followed it for a while, but lost the trail in a rocky area. I kept moving, checking ridges and valleys, keeping an eye out for movement. By midday, I had covered a lot of ground but hadn't seen a single animal. That was strange. This place was usually full of life. Squirrels, birds, the occasional coyote passing through. But the woods felt empty. I kept hunting. I wasn't about to head back empty-handed. By late afternoon, I finally saw something. I was moving along a ridge when I spotted a deer in the valley below. A big buck standing still among the trees. He was just standing there, not moving, his head held high like he was sniffing the air. He was too far to get a clean shot, so I started down the ridge, moving slow, careful not to make any noise. The buck didn't move. I got within range, raised my rifle, and steadied my aim. Then, right as I was about to pull the trigger, he bolted. Not away from me, but straight ahead, deeper into the valley. That didn't make sense. He hadn't seen me. He hadn't smelled me. I was downwind. It was like something ahead had scared him. I hesitated, looked around, listened. Nothing. I decided to follow. I don't know why, I just did. I moved slowly, watching for any sign of him. I found tracks in the damp earth, followed them for a while, deeper into the trees. Then I saw something that made me stop. The tracks ended, just stopped. There was no sign of struggle, no disturbed earth like he had jumped or kicked up dirt, just tracks that led into nothing. That didn't make sense. I stood there for a long time, looking around, scanning the trees. The silence was heavier now, pressing in on me. My instincts told me something wasn't right. I turned back. I made it a few steps before I noticed something else. Another set of tracks. Not deer, human, barefoot. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the mud. They weren't there before. I was sure of it. They came from the trees and stopped right near where the deer's tracks had ended. I felt my stomach drop. I listened, held my breath. Nothing. I left. I didn't run, but I moved fast. I kept my rifle up, my eyes scanning the trees, my ears straining for any sound. I made it back to camp just as the sun was setting. I didn't stay. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my truck. I didn't bother with the fire. I just wanted to get out. The drive back was slow. The trail was rough and I had to take it easy. My hands were tight on the wheel, my rifle sitting in the passenger seat. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see something behind me. I didn't. I made it home late that night, sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time, just sitting there, trying to understand what had happened. I never could. A few days later, I looked up the area. No hunting reports, no missing hikers, no strange sightings, just empty woods. I never went back, and I don't hunt anymore.